This is a paper I wrote when I was in Indonesia. I was asked to participate in an international conference on terrorism. Indonesians are plenty worried about it. They have a part of their country in Aceh, northern Sumatra, where there are sort of a concentration of terrorists, militant Muslims. When I was asked, I said, well, I'm not a specialist, I don't know anything. Um, but they wanted me, so I decided I would just apply Aristotle's virtues and vices to the example of terrorism. Um, I will mention in a couple places the US, September 11th, but it doesn't really matter. These are more general principles. We don't need to point fingers. I do think Americans should have learned some lessons from our reaction to September 11th, and I am kind of dubious about whether the majority of Americans have learned the lessons I think they should have learned. But life will go on, and this paper, because I'm a philosopher, I want people all over the world to reflect and not obsess, not blame one country, not obsess about one country, but just kind of figure out there's patterns here that everyone in the world is accountable to. Certain ways of reacting that are better and some that are worse. Global terrorism is a problem faced by many, if not all, nation states today. By terrorism, I mean, quote, a deliberate effort on the part of an organized group motivated by an ideological cause to undermine the stability of a nation through random acts of violence, unquote. Since the goal is to undermine social and political stability, the solution cannot be entirely taken on by politicians. A society has to defend itself against terrorism in ways that go beyond the exercise of military force, intelligence gathering, and diplomacy. Citizens have a responsibility to prevent the growth of terrorism within their societies, between themselves, as well as to protect themselves against outside threats. Aristotle's theory of the virtues and vices is a comprehensive and systematic examination of all the ways human beings, from the time they are born, develop those character traits necessary to create and sustain stable societies, societies that do not inspire citizens to become terrorists, and societies where citizens can defend themselves against internal and external threats. Like all social problems, terrorism must be understood from as many perspectives as possible before citizens will know what choices to make in any given situation of a terrorist attack or threat. This paper uses the categories of Aristotle to examine the many ways the problem of terrorism must be addressed. Self-control. Like all the other animals, human beings naturally seek to achieve the highest level of well-functioning possible for them. Unlike other animals, human beings have a very complex set of natural capacities that must be developed to become fully human. Human beings also have the power of choice. They can deliberately choose to direct their natural capacities toward natural and creative, or toward unnatural and destructive ends. For Aristotle, the goal of human life is to exercise practical and theoretical wisdom, the highest level of the realization of all human capabilities. When they're very small, children begin living in ways that are virtuous or vicious. They're not consciously aware of this. They learn obedience and imitation. When authority figures act rationally, their ways of life lead to human flourishing for themselves and their children. When their children grow up, they will connect the ways they have behaved with a conscious awareness of why this was rational. When authority figures are irrational, children grow up imitating the wrong behavior. In making the transition from childhood to adulthood, young people must consciously link their behavior to reasoning. At that point, they become morally responsible for knowing the difference between virtue and vice, good and evil, justice and injustice, and for choosing the better over the worse. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is intended as a guide for students and a reminder to adults. It is an appeal to human reason, defining the virtues and vices. It gives citizens a model against which they can compare their own behavior and against which they can evaluate their societies as better or worse, more just or less just, based on whether citizens and rulers nurture and honor virtue or vice. The first and perhaps most fundamental virtue is self-control, the virtue in relation to pleasure and pain, especially in relation to eating, drinking, and sex. The goal is moderation, not to seek physical pleasures too much or too little, but to live moderately in every aspect of life. This is the first virtue cultivated in children. Children have to learn not to be impulsive and to take pleasure in controlling themselves. Those who take excess pleasure in physical gratification eventually become greedy. They need money to satisfy their desires. This virtue is either cultivated or corrupted within the household and the family. There are two principles in deciding how to set up a household: natural acquisition and unnatural acquisition. Natural acquisition leads to a household where family members live moderately and take pleasure in doing so. Unnatural acquisition leads to excesses of all sorts within the household, houses that are too big and filled with unnecessary material goods. This way of life is caused by the corruption of desire, by taking pleasure in material things rather than in the cultivation of more sophisticated human capabilities. Aristotle claims that the political evil is pleonexia, the desire for more than one share of material and social goods people must compete for. When citizens are driven by pleonexia, they ignore their responsibilities as citizens to act in ways that promote a stable community of individuals who are trustworthy and who have goodwill toward each other. Pleonexia leads people to compete with each other and to betray or ignore each other. When the majority of citizens have excess desires, the rich inevitably get richer and the poor poorer. The rich can control those who rule and force politicians to make laws that favor their own accumulation of wealth. Those who have less resent the rich, creating animosity between the classes. A society driven by greed undermines itself. It makes itself weak and unable to protect itself from outside threats. A society driven by greed makes itself more vulnerable to terrorism, both from within and from without. It sets a model of excess wealth that citizens in other nations and within the nation resent. Sometimes the flaunting of wealth leads to attacks by terrorists. Terrorists mostly simply want to undermine the stability of a nation that flaunts its wealth. Terrorists know that such naked greed indicates indifference to the poverty and suffering of others. Even worse, when the rich act with impunity and trigger a terrorist attack, in other words, they want to attack another country for their natural resources or just to gain power and wealth, they can use that attack to oppress the poor even more. They can claim that the nation has to go to war or prepare for war. Hence, economic resources have to be directed toward the military, not toward improving the standard of living and of education of the working class. As working class salaries decline or jobs are lost, members of that class are willing to sign up for the military. If no one is drafted into the military against his or her will, no one thinks they are treated unjustly, so they don't criticize the war. Further, so-called terrorism can be used as a way to generate fear among the lower classes, leading them to think the ruling elite is actually protecting them from harm, rather than the cause of the original terrorist attack, either by aggressively wanting to attack another country for its resources, or else by flaunting its wealth so much that outsiders resent the country and they attack it. The wealthy and powerful can then blame terrorists for the decline of the working class. deflecting working people from holding their elites responsible and accountable for their greed and its place in the triggering of a terrorist attack. The wealthiest believe they can avoid personal harm from any terrorist attack and from going to war, and they're indifferent to the suffering they brought on by their excesses. This entire social dynamic shows that although it appears that the choices people make about consumption of goods and services in the privacy of their homes is completely personal and detached from social and political life, it's actually the most important factor in creating a society that can or cannot protect itself against terrorism. Greed incites people to become terrorists and attack. Greed leads to the denial of a need to plan ahead. Greed causes a society to become destabilized by an outside attack and also by the destabilization of the relation between the citizens, both rich versus poor and among the poor and working class. In a well-run society of thrifty adults, an outside attack will bind citizens together against their common enemy. The rich will be willing to pay their share to meet the costs of national security. In a society governed by greed, the rich will use the military to aggressively attack another country in order to gain wealth, and will send the bill to members of the middle and lower class, as well as recruiting them into the war effort and putting them in harm's way. The second virtue is courage, the ability to act well in situations involving fear. The human condition is one of great vulnerability. There are many things to be afraid of. The fears related to physical pain are sickness, old age, attacks from external enemies, violence from fellow citizens, and the ever-present ability to be accidentally physically harmed. The psychological fears are fear of poverty, fear of being a social failure, fear of isolation, fear of loss of reputation, fear of false rumors perpetrated against you, and fear of the betrayal of friends. Moral courage involves taking the risk to speak out on an issue or to act, even when one knows or fears the condemnation of friends and fellow citizens. Political courage requires taking the risk of loss of popularity and power for the sake of doing what is in fact best in cases where the desires of the majority are irrational and not in the long-term interest of the nation. Wealthy citizens are not the only people who use the threat of terrorism and a terrorist attack to increase their own wealth. Ambitious politicians can abuse the threat of terrorism as a tool to manipulate citizens and centralize their power. If the politicians come from the military sector, they create a collective phobia of so-called terrorists to legitimize a huge increase in military personnel and power. If the politicians favor the wealthy, they create a collective phobia of terrorists to legitimize huge acquisitions of weapons, thereby enriching manufacturers who in turn use their money to pay for the political campaigns of candidates who will use their power to protect their economic interests at the expense of the middle and lower classes. Power-hungry individuals who might or might not believe they are the only people able to control terrorism will find others to blame, get elected, and exercise power at their own will, ignoring the rule of law or any other limitations of power. Such rulers destroy the ability of the majority of citizens to live stable middle-class lives. They also trigger further resentment in people elsewhere, which can trigger another terrorist attack. A nation so internally divided cannot focus its energies on the actual problem of terrorism, the breeding of terrorists from within its own citizenry, and the threat of an attack from without. Reasonable choices in a crisis cannot be made, choices about how to allocate resources reasonably in a way that will support those programs, personnel from the military, intelligence, and diplomacy branches of government that are most likely to address the problems. Citizens are too distracted or too fearful to recognize a politician who has a reasonable plan or the more reasonable plan among the candidates, and to vote to put him or her into office. They might vote for a leader who prefers to blame and demonize terrorists, leading to the greater possibility of an attack, motivated by resentment. They might vote for a leader who makes reasonable decisions, but who is criticized for being reasonable, rather than feeding the people an oversimplified view of the situation, one that blames the terrorists rather than examining the possible ways the people themselves aggravate terrorist attacks, or their leaders do. There's no way a society whose citizens refuse to acknowledge that the situation is complex will be able to address the problem of terrorism. The politically courageous approach would be to try and educate the public, to model the behavior of every mature human being when facing a problem, especially a difficult one. A nation that has been attacked should seek out the empathy of allies. It should increase programs that improve the communication network between allies so that they will share information and create networks between the intelligence, diplomatic, and military communities in each society, and possible dangers can be recognized early. Possible terrorists can be identified and attacks can be prevented. The threat of terrorism should be used as a way to unite people and nations. The goal is to identify and isolate the terrorists, not to divide and isolate citizens throughout the world who live lives of basic decency and who seek to establish goodwill and trust between themselves and other nations. This kind of approach needs to be explained to citizens so they learn the language of deliberation, the ability to think clearly and act well in critical, complex situations that usually require compromise and debate rather than idealizing oneself and finding somebody else to demonize. Even-temperedness, acting well in situations involving anger. When attacked, politicians can provide the best model for how to express outrage when their nations have been treated unjustly. Overreacting with the desire for revenge is one extreme. It does not solve the problem and usually makes the situations worse. Greek tragedies in Homer are filled with characters who express righteous indignation at injustices they suffer, personally or collectively. When they give in to the desire to take revenge, they do even more destruction than was done to them. The message is clear. Do not give into this immediate impulse. Control irrational emotions through the use of reason. Do what is best, not what feels good at the time. And I'll give one example of my country. After the World Trade Tower attack, Americans responded with the majority of Americans, not me, responded with the desire for revenge. After condemning the killing of quote-unquote innocent lives, meaning non-combatants, not meaning women and children in neighborhoods or hospitals or schools, 71% of Americans polled said they would accept a military response even if it meant killing some innocent lives, which does mean women, children, hospitals, and schools. Political leaders directed this impulsive and excessive rage toward Saddam Hussein, even when informed scholars, historians, diplomats, and military personnel knew that Saddam was a secular leader who despised and was despised by the Muslim extremists who orchestrated the terrorist attack. The blind rage of Americans prevented them from gaining knowledge before figuring out the best way to respond. Ambitious politicians and corporate leaders who wanted access to the oil in Iraq at bargain prices used this rage to attack Iraq. Their shock and awe strategy led to the bombing and deaths of many more non-combatants than had been killed on September 11th. Many, many, many more. They established a policy of torturing those arrested for possible terrorist activities. They did much more damage than was done to the USA, just as occurs in Greek tragedy and Homer. It was classic. Generosity. Setting up programs for economic development. Many acts of terrorism, but not by any means all, are committed by young people who come of age only to realize they have no opportunity to develop their talents, get a job, raise a family, and have a basic level of stability and enjoyment of life, actually exercising the capabilities according to the United Nations. Wealthy nations can prevent more terrorism by demonstrating the virtue of generosity, setting up economic development projects throughout the world. These can be and are funded by private corporations, governments, or other private organizations such as churches. For Aristotle, generosity is important for establishing goodwill and trust between citizens. This is true both within a nation and in the relationship between nations. In the current era of globalization, there have been many eras of globalization before, of course, the particular dynamic between wealthy nations and poor nations has the potential to trigger good or bad will, trust or distrust, or it is triggering these things all the time. Communications networks are set up at every level of human interaction, from Facebook and Twitter to international intelligence gathering and international terrorist networking. The potential for establishing positive or negative bonds is huge and changes continually. Wealthy nations have to choose whether to be generous and find productive ways to establish bonds of trust and goodwill, or whether to ignore other nations' problems, creating animosity. Wealthy nations also have the power to exploit the less powerful for their natural and human resources, creating even more animosity, resentment, and distrust. Terrorist movements gain from a climate of animosity, competition, and distrust, both in their ability to recruit followers and in their ability to find vulnerabilities within each nation and between nations that can be exploited and attacked. Spending money on nation building, as the U.S. has been supposed to be doing in Afghanistan, is a necessary part of any serious foreign policy. War, both economic and military, creates more problems than it solves. It is a sign of failure, the failure to find nonviolent ways to solve problems between nations and peoples. Rational humor. And I wrote this before the Charlie Hebdo event, so you can think about it in the light of that. Aristotle also discusses rational humor, the mean between being vulgar or being boring. At one extreme, a vulgar person appeals to irrational emotions to get a laugh and feeds people's resentments and more primitive drives. At the other extreme, a person with no sense of humor can be unable to take life in stride, to acknowledge that things happen in daily life that makes all of one's serious efforts to live well seem hopeless and obsessive. Without a sense of humor, a serious person will become obsessive and permanently frustrated in the drive to live well. The issue of international terrorism has been addressed by professional comedians, sometimes in ways that can help, and at other times in ways that hinder the international effort to minimize this continual and global threat. A comedy skit that aims to make fun of excess demonization of terrorists and terrorism can help people recognize their irrational fears, laugh at themselves, and change. A comedy skit that portrays incompetent leaders trying to address the issue in ways that are comic in their ignorance, their unwillingness to work together, or other kinds of malfunctioning, might trigger a short-lived laugh, but the overriding effect might be a deep cynicism and distrust of all leadership. When the majority of people either blindly follow leaders or blindly reject all politicians as corrupt, they cannot make crucial distinctions between better and worse leaders. Skits about incompetent rulers can lead audiences to become more critical about which leaders are truly competent and just, and which are only good at rhetorical speeches. In order to educate audiences, images of incompetence should be juxtaposed with images of competent leaders who are, perhaps comically, trying to do what is best and being frustrated by numerous obstacles. The wise leaders who can also laugh at silly obstacles and still continue to do what is best set a model for audiences to follow in their own lives in addressing the problems they face, keeping them focused on what is important while taking all the obstacles in stride. Greek tragedies always include one character that makes the best choice. With that character in mind, audiences can better see that all the other characters are wrong and why they're wrong, what they should have said or done in the given situation. And of course, I'm going to write a paper in the next month with a more sophisticated discussion of rational humor. But this paragraph, it just plants the seed for someone who's listening to think about it. Sociability, the ability to accept various minor injuries and slights in order to stay focused on the more important goals. Sociability is the ability to keep one's social life in perspective. The human condition is so complex that people end up being treated by others unjustly, either deliberately or unconsciously. People find themselves in situations they did nothing to create, suffering from other people's ignorance, incompetence, or just from the complexity of human social life. A sociable person puts up with various slights, minor humiliation, or minor injustices in order to preserve social harmony and goodwill. When other people recognize this kind of strength of character, they appreciate it and know how much it contributes to preventing the social fabric from coming unraveled more than it already so often does. A person with this virtue does not expect it to be recognized, but simply acts this way for the sake of creating a deeper layer of civilization, more than a mere veneer. When it is recognized, however, others often understand the great contribution of someone who does not act out, as opposed to the more obvious contribution of people when they publicly do something that everyone knows makes a contribution. In the case of terrorism, sociability is required in order to ensure that people working in all the bureaucratic networks set up to contain terrorism are working together. The military, the intelligence community, and the diplomatic corps have to put up with various efforts of one agency or one employee to take over power inappropriately, or to accuse someone unjustly of making a serious mistake, or other ways that a huge network can turn into an ineffective, self-destructive bureaucracy. Sociability is also required between citizens, or else the social fabric will break down in ways that nurture terrorism. Muslims in predominantly non-Muslim societies have to put up with some degree of prejudice against them, but they also have to be proactive in creating cultural spaces where dialogues about Islam and dialogues between Muslims and non-Muslims can create bonds of trust and goodwill. Non-Muslims also have to be proactive in creating cultural spaces where such dialogues take place. Unjustified prejudices of all sorts unravel the social fabric, making it more difficult to contain the most primitive drive, survival instinct, from erupting in antisocial ways, destroying everyone affected by it. And so, of course, terrorism would be more of a threat and more effective if somebody does commit such a kind of attack. Rational ambition, making good decisions about one's talents, developing them, and then managing one's career in the way that enables one to use one's talents in the service of personal, social, and political well-being. To be able to prevent and respond to terrorist attacks well, many citizens will have to have the desire and skills necessary to find, arrest, and appropriately punish terrorists. Skilled people are needed in the military, diplomacy, intelligence sectors, as well as law enforcement. The first step toward achieving that goal is to make sure one's society is truly a meritocracy, a society where people are given opportunities for education and then for careers based on their natural talents and proven skills, demonstrated through experience and an exemplary career history. No society will be able to address the problem of terrorism if it is not a meritocracy. When people are given education and skills based on their wealth, their family name, or their connections, they will lack the natural ability and the self-discipline necessary to do their jobs well. Incompetent leadership harms a society in every sector: education, medicine, business, law, transportation, legislation, law enforcement, etc. In a single quick moment, a terrorist attack exposes the ability of powerful people in many sectors of society to have a good sense of what is best and be able to work together with other people to respond quickly to the problem. If it exposes a society based on the privilege of the few, a great mistrust emerges between those with privilege and power and those without. The less privileged become less motivated to contribute to a society that does not protect or show any concern for them. The quality of life in every sector of society declines. Corrupt politicians will be that much more motivated to find a scapegoat within the citizenry and outside or outsiders. And this has become a big issue in police force, whether the police are hired based on merit or whether there's some spirit of acceptance of overreacting in situations, and then a loss of trust on the part of the citizens. And basically it's just at this point the dialogue needs to be we need to have a dialogue, we need to get data, we need to get community organizing, we need to get the police force in touch with the public. We need to work it out, because since 9/11, there's been more violence and animosity between citizens in many, many sectors of society for many, many reasons. Rational honor, knowing what ways of life and actions most benefit a society as a whole, and using public honor as a way to motivate citizens to imitate it. In every sector of society, those who have positions of authority, as parents, teachers, administrators, business leaders, doctors, lawyers, etc., should always use their power to set up a system of rewards that promotes the well-being of those over whom they rule, those whose lives are affected by the exercise of this kind of power. Business leaders should not be rewarded or admired simply because they found a way to get rich. Rather, they should be honored for finding ways to engage in philanthropy or other business ventures that promote social well-being in ways other than simply a society's ability to accumulate wealth. Doctors should not be rewarded simply for doing their job, making sick people healthy, but also for setting up programs or making information available that focuses on preventing and maintaining public health, on the overall well-being of all citizens. In the case of addressing the problem of terrorism, all contributors should be honored for their contribution. Certainly the military should be honored when a military response is indeed the only alternative. But there's a great danger in overvaluing military responses to all situations of unjust and violent aggression against oneself or against one's country. The military class ought to publicly acknowledge the importance of diplomacy and intelligence gathering as the best way for the military to do its part well. A strong military force is worthless without adequate intelligence or without the wrong information. Any military interventions have to be accompanied by diplomatic exchanges between neighboring nations and between leaders of different sectors within a nation, to minimize the need or desire for violence and to prevent permanent enmity and future violence. Again, terrorist threats or attacks provide an excellent opportunity for opportunist and authoritarian rulers to gain power. If they use the attack to centralize their power, they will honor the military as the only appropriate response. They will cripple the power of the diplomatic and intelligence sectors. as not forceful enough, making citizens more vulnerable. They will justify their own takeover or centralization of power based on the need to protect the public against the so-called terrorist threat. Rational rhetoric, the realm of communications and media. The power of rhetoric has always been great, but in a high-tech era it's greater than ever. Citizens in one part of the world can see visual images of events on the other side of the world and either identify with or make evil demons of the human-looking images on the screen. The ability to observe media images of what is actually happening, rather than listen to rumors, should enable citizens to make judgments based on facts. Yet the images are projected without any context and lead anyone to draw any inferences they want, without regard for what sort of response is most likely to prevent future events, like the one on the screen. When all communication systems are driven by the need to make a profit, broadcasters gain from presenting the most sensationalist images that trigger the most immediate, impulsive, and irrational responses. The most irrational and violent actions attract the most viewers, motivated by either the desire for self-preservation or for power or both. This is particularly true of terrorist attacks. The appropriate response is to provide an opportunity for analysts to put the events into a broader context and to give a reasoned argument for a reasonable long-term response that will contain the problem, even if it will not ever be resolved completely. The public should develop the desire just to respond rationally rather than emotionally. They should know through personal experience or through a study of history, philosophy, and politics that overreacting only leads to more violence and animosity. A society cannot prevent authoritarianism unless enough of the citizens are educated enough to be able to react reasonably to violent attacks. Citizens need to learn to live under the rule of law, even when that rule has been violated by their enemies. The habit of deferring to universal and international law in cases of terrorist attacks will have to be developed among people throughout the world before the problem of international terrorism can be adequately addressed. Once the public understands the need for deferring to international law, they will gravitate toward news programs and other networks of communication that explain how the rule of law is being applied and enforced in each case. Citizens in each nation have to be convinced that the community of leaders who govern by international law are handling the problem of international terrorism better than any individuals or individual nations acting on their own. Collective and cooperative strategies should work best, and the public should be educated to know this, to stay informed, and to accept the truth if it is, in fact, true. The art of legislation, knowing how to make laws that contain the problem, not too severe and not too permissive. Although I've spoken to this issue before, the issue of terrorism is particularly powerful in the ability of a power-hungry politician to use a terrorist attack or even the threat of a terrorist attack to create authoritarian and unjust laws, laws that punish non-terrorists, or laws that punish those arrested for possible terrorism too harshly. The goal of the laws should be to create an environment based on social institutions and those who run them that nurtures a stable middle-class society, even if the lawmakers themselves come from a monarchy, an inherited aristocracy, or the rulers elected by the majority in a democracy. A terrorist attack can easily be used by politicians to justify all sorts of concentrations of power, such as wiretapping and other forms of spying on citizens that are otherwise illegal. The immediate creation of laws that centralize power unnecessarily without sufficient evidence that such laws will help contain the problem of terrorism. Also, unnecessary searches of people's homes and other personal aspects of their lives. Further, arresting and holding people prisoners without giving them access to a lawyer and a fair trial within a reasonable amount of time. Next, censorship of the press, etc. Citizens have to be diligent about demanding necessary laws and rejecting excessive interference of government in people's lives. Distribution of social goods and resources. In relation to terrorism, political leaders must decide how much money they want to invest for a government bureaucracy dedicated to intelligence gathering and a strong police force to catch terrorists, and how much they should invest in schools and economic development that provide jobs and a decent standard of living so that citizens will be invested in their societies and will not want to undermine their own stability and security. The art of distributing social goods wisely is imprecise and has to be adjusted continually. Good leadership requires the continual study of whether the number of attacks and of terrorists is increasing or decreasing, and what can be done to stem the tide or preserve a relatively stable status quo. Leaders also have to be continually gathering information about the quality of life among the citizens, whether the middle class is increasing or shrinking, whether animosity between the rich and poor is getting better and worse. Leaders also have to identify areas of the society that seem to be breeding terrorists, whether they are political parties, particular municipalities, rural areas, particular schools, people who gather at particular religious shrines or places of worship, particular ethnic groups, or any other subclass of citizens that has been shown to breed terrorists and terrorist sympathizers. These are not all Muslims. These can be Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazi groups, all sorts of groups, regardless of race, ethnicity, sex, whatever. Social resources then have to be used to try to solve the problem through a combination of threats of punishments and promises of rewards for improvement. Unjust searches or arrests without any evidence will only breed more resentment and more terrorists. The rectification of wrongs. The procedures for arresting possible terrorists should be the same as those for any other possible criminal act. A certain degree of evidence, imprisonment in jails that have the same degree of comfort as jails for any other arrested person, citizen or non-citizen, the same amount of bail or decision not to allow bail as given for any other similar crime, a public defender for those who cannot afford their own, a trial before an impartial judge or jury, etc. The problem of terrorism is not solved by breaking down the rule of law, by acting more like the terrorists themselves when prosecuting those arrested for this crime. Rather, overreacting only makes the problem worse, because over such an action of emotion-driven revenge triggers a counter-reaction by bystanders who can easily find out the facts. That perpetuates the violence. Since terrorist acts are by definition committed by people who appear to be decent human beings mingling in society, reacting with vengeance leads to more such quote-unquote average citizens and makes the general public more vulnerable to another such attack. There are no armies or military uniforms for people to recognize terrorists, so extreme punishments only give the public more to fear. A politician should not make laws that justify and even require such extreme reactions in order to create the appearance of being supposedly tough on terrorism, when the facts reveal that such laws actually are tough on citizens. Rulers who use the threat of terrorism to break their own laws only expose themselves as hypocrites and create a climate of ignoring the habit of respect for the rule of law. This increases the possibility of vigilante justice, of individual citizens who take it into their own hands to kill those they think are terrorists, leading to more and more violence and reactions to that violence. This has happened in the U.S. since 9/11. The Bush administration's tough on terrorist policies have led to a huge increase in hate groups and vigilante justice in relation to many resentments between citizens, not just fear of terrorists. Um, Violent crimes against homosexuals have increased dramatically. These crimes are indeed acts of terrorism insofar as they undermine the social fabric and the rule of law that holds it together. No one thinks homosexuals are more violent than anyone else. The violence against them is just one more example of ignorance and the desire to find someone to blame for social decline. When the government sets a model of willingness to break the laws to take revenge on some group that is undermining the social fabric, citizens take it upon themselves to determine who they think is also undermining the social fabric and punish them as they see fit. Equity, applying the laws in particular situations. In cases where citizens or foreigners have been arrested and taken to trial for crimes associated with terrorism, the courtroom procedures and sentences should conform to standard practices in all cases of criminal violence. Within the courtroom, lawyers should not use shameless rhetoric to win their cases against those accused of terrorism by appealing to prejudices and the desire for revenge instead of to facts and reasonable inferences from facts. Lawyers who are ambitious for power or wealth should not gain status and wealth in their profession by developing reputations for winning in cases where those accused of terrorism are prosecuted, if those reputations are based on rhetoric that appeals to primitive drives that tear apart the social fabric. Judges and juries should not hand down excessively severe punishments as a way to prevent future attacks. Decisions based on a desire for revenge rather than a desire to return to respect for the rule of law are most likely to lead to social instability in the long run. Because terrorism is a controversial and highly publicized issue, citizens get some information about terrorism daily on various news outlets. Citizens are bound to disagree on some decisions the government makes and to disagree with fellow citizens. Any society that wants to be stable over time must allow citizens to demonstrate publicly their dissatisfaction with the government's handling of the issue of terrorism or any other issue. If some people think the government is too lax, they ought to be able to express themselves through nonviolent demonstrations. If some people think the government is too harsh or is breaking its own laws, they ought to be able to express their views through nonviolent demonstrations. The written word is not enough. The spoken word and giving permits to march also need to be part of the way a society educates itself and citizens educate each other about how to contain the threat of terrorism. The police force ought to be trained and told not to overreact to citizen demonstrations, even when the citizens become violent. Those with guns and the law on their side have all the power. They should not feel threatened. They should not allow their personal opinions or emotions to interfere with doing their jobs well. They are paid by the state to protect the state and cannot be allowed to use the guns they have to act on their immediate impulses. Their function is to protect the security of citizens and public health and safety. When they set a model of self-restraint, citizens are more likely to follow it and condemn those who act violently. When they set a model of ignoring laws that are designed to preserve social order, citizens are more likely to buy their own guns and make their own decisions about what is best, apart from the rule of law. Those who are found guilty should be punished, imprisoned for life if necessary, but not tortured or given much harsher sentences based on a lot less material evidence. Neither fear nor vengeance should be allowed to govern the process of obeying and applying the use of the rule of law. This is always true, but is particularly difficult to follow and particularly important to follow in cases involving possible terrorist attacks. Using the social sciences and sciences to contain terrorism. Even with the best of intentions, even when one desires to do what is wisest and best, the containment of terrorism requires hiring many professionals trained in the sciences and social sciences. Those trained in forensic sciences can use technology and their knowledge base to confirm or refute various claims made in a courtroom. Science and technology must be used to set up a body of relevant knowledge and make it accessible to all governments involved in trying to contain terrorism. Bodies of knowledge must be accumulated to investigate a terrorist act after the fact. Nations trying to contain terrorism must develop a body of knowledge about who the terrorists are, the groups they belong to, where they live, how they function in society, etc. Nations should work together to form a global network, a network that requires high levels of specialized training. This is fact gathering, and computers get used and all sorts of stuff. Specialists in the social sciences are needed to study the profiles of the lives of terrorists and to explain patterns of the environment out of which they emerged. Environments that are particularly prone to breeding terrorists have to be changed. Governments must use various ways of creating less toxic environments through offering economic and other incentives in exchange for a commitment on the part of leaders in those communities to condemn terrorist acts. The incentives cannot be so great, however, that citizens who have respected the rule of law are given less than those who have not. This only rewards violence and the threat of violence as a way to receive more government funding than others. Providing children with the goods and services necessary to pull them out of poverty and the continual fear that haunts the poor is one necessary step. Educating children to understand the rule of law and the social and political system they are born into, teaching them a healthy patriotism, can also prevent homegrown terrorists. Practical wisdom. Aristotle's virtues are habitual ways of reacting to the many problems we face in daily life. These virtues together form the kind of person who can react well in critical situations, situations where the best choice is difficult to discern, where the stakes are high because many people and the future of the nation are affected, where the public is affected physically, and where large segments of the population have radically different, incompatible views of how to deal with the problem. Aristotle lists a number of virtues that have to be exercised at the time the decision is being made. First, practical wisdom requires an accurate understanding of the object of choice, the ultimate objective, the greatest good to be achieved in policies and actions in relation to, in this case, terrorism. George W. Bush's quote-unquote war on terrorism, the way he tried to convince the American public that all terrorists could be found and put away, was both too vague and completely unrealistic. Trying to wipe out terrorists and terrorism will only lead to extremely authoritarian government and to a violent counter-reaction by citizens and non-citizens alike. Instead, the only reasonable goal is for national leaders to work together, developing a network of communications and intelligence so that terrorist networks can be identified and either prosecuted under national or international law, or contained and monitored to prevent more attacks. Preventing terrorist attacks is a more reasonable goal than eliminating terrorists and supposedly terrorism. Next, practical wisdom requires being able to articulate all the possible options in a particular case where something has to be done. These options will vary in each case and at different times, but leaders can fail to do what is best simply because the best choice was not even considered. This can happen in many different ways. Perhaps the options considered were all too extreme and did not include a more moderate way of compromising and addressing the issue in a number of ways simultaneously. Perhaps the wrong people were consulted to meet and work out what would be done. Perhaps not enough people were involved in the discussions. There are many ways this aspect of problem solving can go wrong. Next, practical wisdom is the ability to choose what is truly best among the options and to be able to explain why it's best. It's important to articulate the reasons because the reasons provide a worldview about the problem in general. One decision is connected to another, forming a systematic way of recognizing and solving the many dimensions of the problem and every problem. It's possible to do the right thing but for the wrong reason. If so, future decisions will be wrong because the underlying understanding of the issue is misguided. For example, a politician might advocate a moderate and rational choice in one case, but because this is the only way to get elected at that point in time. In the future, the same politician would make the wrong choice because the public demanded an extreme reaction, one that the ruler knew would only lead to more terrorism. This is not the way to address the issue. The person of practical wisdom will want to do what he or she knows is best, even if it requires political risk and courage, even if there are other negative consequences unrelated to what is best to solve this particular problem. Normal people's lives and societies are so complex that doing what is best to solve one problem always has some negative impact on another aspect of social and political lives. If the level of terrorism goes up, for example, to the point where resources for education have to be diverted to law enforcement, this still might be the best option, even if regrettable. Finally, the person with practical wisdom has the skill to be able to persuade the public and those who have to carry out the choice to actually do it. Decisions related to containing terrorism have to be agreed upon by everyone involved in the choice being made. If resources for law enforcement go up, the police have to actually use those resources to improve the monitoring and containment of possible threats, not to divert it either because they do not think it will achieve the goal or simply to enrich themselves. If resources for law enforcement go down, the police have to continue containing terrorists, but with fewer resources. They should not be allowed to become lazy or even to deliberately do a poor job simply in order to receive more funding the next year. Politicians should not act on the assumption that terrorism always increases if funds are cut and always decreases if more funding is directed to it. The cause might be the deliberate failure of professionals to do their jobs or their well-intentioned incompetence. No one should be allowed to, or really even want to, sabotage the process of containing terrorism for the sake of personal gain. These problems are rooted in the early habituation of children and the overall spirit of a nation. A nation of exclusively self-interested people will never be able to solve any social or political problems, particularly not one as serious and potentially threatening as terrorism. Another character trait related to practical wisdom is the power of good judgment, by which Aristotle means the ability to have good opinions when discussing the choices and lives of other people. This kind of reflection is important. Discussing with friends and fellow citizens how people in the past or present have lived their lives, which lives were better or worse, and why, which choices were better or worse, and why, is an important way to learn how to live. Such dialogues prepare a person for the choices they will have to make. Such dialogues give people ideas for how to reflect upon what they have done in the past. Perhaps above all else, talking about the human condition should make it clear to everyone that every citizen needs to become informed about public life, to find their talents, cultivate them, and use them to promote the common good. Every citizen needs to recognize that he or she must reject corruption, using their wealth or power to amass more rather than to promote collective well-being. Citizens must recognize their responsibility to perform their professional duties well. Their fellow citizens depend on them, pay them, and trust them to do so. A study of the past should make clear that when too many citizens are concerned only for their own welfare at the expense of everyone else,